חברים יקרים, אנחנו שמחים על הדיון הער שהתעורר כאן, ואנחנו שמחים גם לפתוח את המושב השלישי. לפני שאנחנו פותחים אותו, אני רוצה להסביר למי שהמושב השלישי יתקיים בשפה האנגלית. יש לנו שני מרצים מאתיופיה, וחוקר ישראלי שגם כן ידבר באנגלית, כדי שכל המושב יהיה באותה שפה. אז מי שמעוניין לשמוע בשפה המקורית, באנגלית, את המושב, יכול פשוט להקשיב לנו כמו שעכשיו. מי שרוצה לשמוע תרגום סימולטני לעברית, צריך בזום ללחוץ על interpretation, יש סימן של גלובוס, ובאינטרפרטיישן ללחוץ על היברו, וברגע שהוא יעשה את זה, הוא ישמע תרגום לעברית של ההרצאות שיהיו באנגלית. אני מקווה שזה ברור לכולם, וכולם מצאו את הכפתור, כל מי שמעוניין בתרגום. מי שרוצה להפסיק לשמוע את התרגום, ולחזור לשמוע את הערוץ של השפה באנגלית, פשוט לוחץ על האינטרפרטיישן ואוף, והוא יחזור לערוץ ללא תרגום סימולטני. אני מקווה שזה היה ברור, ואני מתכבד להזמין את דוקטור בת ציון ערקי קלורמן מהאוניברסיטה הפתוחה, שהיא גם חברה בוועדה המדעית של המרכז למורשת יהדות אתיופיה. היא תהיה דוקטור בת ציון, בבקשה. בת ציון?
היא על מיוט.
אוקיי. דוקטור בת ציון, רק אם את יכולה לפתוח את המיקרופון שלך.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. ערב טוב לכולם. We're going to conduct this session in English, and you have the instructions, those who want to listen to the translation into Hebrew. Our third session is going to be on the involvement of the politically autonomous Beta Israel in the politics and military struggles of the northern Ethiopian highlands. Our first discussion will be delivered by Deselen Bizune Ayele from the University of Gondar. He will speak on the Beta Israel Muslim alliances during the Muslim-Christian conflict in the 16th century. Deselen Bizune Ayele, he is assistant professor of history and current head of the Department of History and Heritage Management at the University of Gondar. He is interested in the history and of the people of northwest Ethiopia and the Beta Israel, and he has a special interest in Beta Israel since he was born and grew up in the Dembia area, where he met and he knew the distinct community of Beta Israel with its very visible presence. So please, Deselen Bizune Ayele, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deselen Bizune Ayele, and I'm an assistant professor of history at the Department of History and Heritage Management in the University of Gondar. Today, I'll be giving a talk on one aspect of the Beta Israel history, which is in line with the theme of the conference that took place on the 19th of January 2022, under the title, The Kingdom of the Gideonites, the political autonomy of the Beta Israel and their wars with the Christian Solomonic kingdom. So for this paper, I will be delivering a talk entitled On the Beta Israel Muslim alliances of the 1530s and early 1540s in Semain and its surroundings. To start with, the Beta Israel in Semain and its surroundings are believed to have lived in this part of the country for hundreds and thousands of years, for that matter. So these people have lived in Semain, Wagara, Walqait, Tagade, Dembia, Kwara, and other parts of the former Gondar province, and also parts of Tigray. So generally speaking, they had been part and parcel of northern and northwestern Ethiopian society for a very long period of time. One peculiar thing about them is, for most part of their history, these people have lived in isolation from the surrounding communities, especially from the Christians, and even from the Muslims. And they have mostly inhabited some inaccessible parts of the province, some mountain tops, valleys, gorges, plateaus, especially in the Semain and Wagara areas, especially after the 14th and 15th centuries, due to their wars with the Christian monarchs. And in the course of time, these people have developed a very strong sense of ethnic identity, owing partly due to their religion. And they had been in continuous conflict with the Christian kings, as I said, mainly because the Christian kings wanted the Beta Israel to convert to Christianity, and the Beta Israel wanted to remain in their faith. So because of this, and also at some points, because the Beta Israel communities in different parts of the province had been revolting against, the appointed governor, had been refusing to pay tribute to the Christian rulers or to their appointees. So because of these reasons, and mainly because of their religion, different religion, they have been in continuous clashes, continuous conflicts with the Christian rulers. These conflicts between the Beta Israel and the Christian kings became especially strong after the 14th century. From the 14th century onwards, we see these conflicts coming now and then, and they also appear to be very destructive for both groups, particularly during the reigns of Emperor Ishaq in the 15th century, and his successors. As I said, very bloody conflicts have taken place. And it was at this time, it was amidst of such a very heightened tension, bloody wars between the Christians and the Beta Israel, that Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim el-Ghazi, nicknamed Ahmad Ibrahim, leading his Adalite Muslims and the Muslims of the east and southeast parts of Ethiopia, came to conquer several portions of the country. Some say that during the height of his power, Ahmed was able to at least occupy 3/4 of Ethiopia. And it was at this juncture that Imam Ahmed's troops reached the northwest, those places where the Beta Israel had inhabited for long. Then, in the mid-1530s, his troops reached the northwest, and then his troops first defeated the Christian force in Wagara, another strategic place there. And after Wagara, the Muslims continued into Semain. At this time, Ahmed is said to have been advised by his followers and even the Muslims of Mazega in the Walqait area not to cross to the Semain, not to try to control the Semain, but he didn't heed that advice. He even is said to have uttered, "We will not abandon the Semain until we have conquered it, for it is the head of the country. If it believes, all the country will believe." End quote. So Ahmed was very much wise in understanding the strategic importance of the Beta Israel locations, the Beta Israel places in Semain and Wagara. As we can understand from his statement, if he was able to control the Semain, the rest of the kingdom, the rest of the Christian territories would fall easily. So that means he had understood the very important strategic significance of this site. And in a very short span of time, as we know, Ahmed's troops had succeeded in bringing this region, the Northwest, under his Muslim empire. And part of this success, part of such a success in a very short span of time came or was because of the support that he obtained from the non-Christian communities of the region. What do we mean by the non-Christian communities? When we say the non-Christian communities, different minorities in this area, we have Muslims in some pockets. We have the Agos pockets in parts of Megameder and Semain also, and Wallo, adjacent Wallo territories. We have the command, we have the Balawo, the Beja, and all these groups of people were welcoming Ahmed to this area. The collaboration and sometimes assistance that Imam Ahmed got during this time in his fight first with Lebedingel, the then Christian emperor, and then his son and successor Galaudios was not limited to the Beta Israel of Semain and Wagara. On various occasions, other groups of people, other minorities or whatsoever, had been supporting Ahmed in different areas for different reasons, of course. For example, the Balaw in Tigray and Eritrea area, the Agao, Muslims of Mazaga, as I said previously, and now the Beta Israel. So Beta Israel alliance with Ahmed at this time can be considered as a result of the Beta Israel being opportunistic, which means they wanted to exploit the existing situation for their own cause. As I said, they had been in continuous clashes with the Christians, so they were resisting Christian domination. It was at this time then Ahmed's troops came. So they wanted to assist Ahmed, they wanted to support Ahmed, ally with Ahmed in their fight against the Christians. So as the famous dictum goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the Muslims and the Beta Israel befriended at this time, at least temporarily. And that was, as I said, to reassert their independence from the Christian domination. As James Quirin argues, Beta Israel in Semain region had in their long history used different tactics to resist domination by the Christian state. Different tactics. And one of such tactics was by creating alliances with other forces, other actors. So in that fighting they had with the Christian kings, wherever the Beta Israel found out a certain third group, third actor being involved, they wanted to use it for, or they wanted to align with that third force. For example, if I quote, with a variety of third forces, such as the Muslim invaders against the state at this time in the 1530s and early 1540s, then the Portuguese contingent against the Muslims, when the Portuguese troops came to Ethiopia under the leadership of Cristóvão da Gama to assist the Christians in their fight with Muhammad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. The Beta Israel had also supported the Portuguese and Claudius. So their assistance was not permanent, they were very closely following the developments, and they made their calculations who to support and who to oppose. So this was the way the Beta Israel had been acting at this time. Tekles Arik Mukria, one of scholars of Ethiopian history, had this book of the Graኝ Hamad Warara, and in that book he says, I quote, በሰሜንና በወገራ የሚኖሩት ፈላሾች ሃይማኖታቸው አይሁድ እንጂ እስላሞች ስላልሆኑ የግራኝን አመጣጥ እንደ መዘጋ እንደ ሀዲያ እንደ በለው ህዝብ በታላቅ ደስታ የተቀበሉት አይመስልም. Because the Beta Israel and the Muslims did not have the same religion, so it was not for religious cause that they supported the Muslims. So they might have not welcomed the Muslims like the other Muslims did, but at least they wanted to create an alliance with them, even though they knew that they are totally different from them. And at any rate, the Beta Israel wanted to exploit the situation, not because they liked Ahmed, as I said, but because Ahmed was against their adversaries, their enemies, the Christian rulers. Therefore, Beta Israel's support to the Muslims was part of their 300 years long resistance against Christian domination. And in 1535, as I mentioned previously, Muslim forces overran Christians in Sameh. At that point, the Beta Israel came in large numbers to Ahmed's side. They came to Ahmed's aid by being his guides in the difficult terrain in Sameh and Wagah. So they became best guides. That was one of the things that they had done in that development during the battles between the Christians and the Muslims. According to Taddasa Tamrat, one of the eminent historians of Ethiopia, in his Church and State, he says this: the Falasha easily submitted to him, to Ahmad, and they became his best guides during his campaigns between the river Takaze and Lake Tana. So in that expand territory between Takaze in the north and Tana in the south, in Dembia, in Wagara, in Walqait, in Sameh, in all these areas, the Beta Israel were very much supportive of Ahmed. Another scholar about the Beta Israel, in fact, who happens to be one of the presenters in this conference today, Stephen Kaplan, he states that during the Muslim conquest of the region, this region in particular, I quote, initially the Beta Israel appeared to have welcomed the Muslim disruption of imperial rule and viewed it as an opportunity to reassert their independence. That was the main reason, as I was saying previously. Again, according to Tekles Arik Mukria, I quote, የአሸናፊው ግራኝ ጦር በትግሬና በጸለምት አልፎ ፈላሾቹ ወደሚገኙበት ወደ ሰሜን ሲመጣ ፈላሾቹ ባለፈው ከክርስቲያኖቹ ጋር ባላቸው ቂም የተነሳ ለግራኝ አግዘው ክርስቲያኖቹን ወግተዋል. So this is just another way of saying that the Beta Israel support to Grañ emanated from the feud they had with the Christians. So they wanted to revenge that, and in order to reassert their independence from Christian domination, they did it. They did support Grañ, or Ahmed, I'm sorry. Ahmed's own chronicler, the Yemeni Arab writer, Arab Faqih, in his book, The Conquest of Abyssinia, he quotes the Beta Israel as saying, between us and the main of Bahr Amba, there is an enmity that dates from 40 years. Now we are going to kill those who remain, and we will take their fortress. This is what the Beta Israel told. Right. Bahr Amba was a place in Semain, and it was a very strong Christian stronghold, at least since the days of Emperor Zara Yaqub in the 14th century. The Christians had converted the Beta Israel there, and they had become dominant in that area. So it was a very much important, location as far as the Semain is concerned. So what the Beta Israel said to Ukraine was, we had a problem with the people of Bahr Amba, with the Christians of Bahr Amba. Now we want to go and then pursue them, attack them, kill them. Then Ahmed accepted that request, and he sent them with some reinforcements, with some Muslim reinforcement, and the Christians subdued. Many of them were killed, some surrendered, and they were brought to Ahmed, who killed all of them. So that's very important stronghold, the Bahr Amba area, in today's Janamur area of North Gondar zone, fell to the Muslims owing to the support that the Muslims had obtained from Beta Israel. So the Beta Israel and the Muslims together took that strategic post. And what Ahmed did then was he stayed there in the Semain until all of that area submitted to his rule. So this means the Beta Israel assistance was very much significant in as far as conquering the Semain is concerned. As I said, for Ahmed, the Semain was very much important because, as he has said already, that was a very strategic point in order to control the rest of the region. The people in the Bahr Amba area and in general in Semain finally were forced to get reconciled with the Beta Israel, and they became their subjects. And Ahmed then appointed Usman bin Jawhir and Faraq Ham Usman to govern Semain. And next we have Wagara. In Wagara, Wazir Abbas became Ahmed's appointee, Ahmed's governor, after a very hard battle, as I said previously. And then from Semain and Wagara, other adjacent territories like Tembia, like Begimidr, gradually fell to Ahmed's conquest. So in all this, the Beta Israel support was very much valuable. And it seems that all the people, including, no one was spared, had all converted to Islam, as Ahmed spared no one from converting, and a lot of mosques were built, as we can infer from his chronicle and other different sources, including the chronicles of the Christian emperors. However, at this time, as time went on, rather, the Beta Israel didn't seem to have enjoyed Muslim overlordship of the area. So at first they welcomed them, they assisted them, but as the days went by, the Beta Israel seemed to understand that the Muslim occupation of the area had its own, negative repercussions as well. So the Beta Israel started to realize that their alliance with the Muslims had brought them clear dangers. Thus, switching sides would become the only option, especially after the days of Ibn and the succession to power of his son and successor, Galaudios, who happens to be a bit pro Beta Israel. I mean, when I say that, he led them to live in their own ways because they had supported him, and partly maybe because his mother, Sabra also belonged to the Semain. And as a result, during the time of Galaudius, it seems that the Beta Israel had made another calculation, and they stopped their support to the Muslims, and now their support would be to the Christians and the Portuguese contingent. So we see from this time onwards, especially after 1540, especially after the arrival of the Portuguese troops, and when the odds started to change, the Beta Israel shifted their allegiance from the Muslims to the Christians. Thus, the Beta Israel had to change sides in 1541, when they began to assist the Portuguese contingent and the new king, Galaudius. James Bruce, who came in the 18th century to the Gondar region, he quotes Gideon and Judith, king and queen of the Jews, in the high country of Samain, after having suffered much from grime, had at last rebelled and joined him. That means Christopher da Gama and the king Galaudius. So he tells us how the Beta Israel, alliance changed from one to the other. And, from the Portuguese sources, we also find out that when the Portuguese controlled some important hills, some important strategic points in Spain, the Beta Israel had been very much helpful. If we quote, 120 Portuguese with a queen, I mean Sabla, took refuge in the Jews' hill. The Jews' hill, a hill in Spain that was under the occupation or the ownership of the Jews, the Beta Israel, recently captured by Dom Cristobal, where they were hospitably received by the commander, whom he had made a Christian. According to Bermudez, the Beta Israel in Semain helped Dom Cristobal in not only guiding through the area, but also in persecuting the Muslims and killing their leader, Sayyid Muhammad, or Sayyid Muhammad as some call him. They also brought Muhammad's head, after killing him, his head to Cristobal as a sign of, trophy, and as a sign of their allegiance, their support to the new forces. So the Beta Israel also presented the wife of the deceased Muslim leader to Cristobal, and Cristobal made her Sayyid Muhammad's wife. He made her his concubine. All this was therefore made possible thanks to the support that he got from the Beta Israel. Pedro Paix, another Jesuit, traveler of that time, had also a section in his book which describes how a certain Jew captain in Semain, the one I mentioned previously, assisted Dom Cristobal to clear an important mountain guarded by the Muslims. That mountain had many horses and was accessible only in one way, and the Portuguese controlled it with the support of the Beta Israel. So horses were very much important in this area, in those fightings between the Christians and the Muslims. So this Jew captain, Beta Israel captain, told Cristobal that there were many horses and there were very many Muslims in a certain hill. So he advised him how to attack that position and how to get those horses. And finally, Cristobal did, with the support of this Beta Israeli leader. The booty collected, including the many horses and mules, were important for the Portuguese in their subsequent battles with the Muslims. Controlling the hill was important, also because it was through it that Galaudius could join the Portuguese and Sabla, his mother. That was the only pass where the Portuguese and the Sabla together would meet Galaudius, the king, who was just wandering here and there. So controlling that strategic heel was important, and that was what the Jews did to the Portuguese and the Christians. Thus, Ahmed needed Beta Israel assistance to conquer the Semen around 1535. That's true. And Galaudius also had their service to free it from the Muslims. It was from here that the Christians made their mobilization for their final assault against the Muslims at Wenadega in 1543. As we know, in 1543, the last major battle between the Christians and the Muslims took place, and it was here in Wenadega, in Denbia, that the Muslim ruler Ahmad ibn al-Melkasi was killed by the Christians and the Portuguese. Also, in return for their support, the Beta Israel had many of their traditional rights and independence, which had been taken away under previous Christian emperors in Semen, restored. So Galaudius' reign is considered as a respite for the Beta Israel, partly because of their support for him, to his victories over the Muslims. Conclusion. During the wars between the Muslims and Christian forces in the 16th century, the Beta Israel forged temporary alliances, first with Ahmad, with the Muslims, and then with Galaudius and the Portuguese. So their allegiance, their assistance, their alliance was not permanent. It depended on the situation. They proved to be very much helpful for the Muslim conquest, for it was due to their assistance that they or Muslims managed to control that area. Similarly, their assistance was highly needed when the Portuguese and Galaudius' forces cleared the Muslims from Semen. And when the final showdown between Galaudius and Ahmed took place in 1543, as I said, at Wenadega in Denbia, not very far from Semen, Beta Israel had perhaps decided the fall. Because of this, the Beta Israel seemed to have been allowed to live in their own ways, at least until the time of Salza Dingri. If I take a phrase from Tekles Adik Nakoya, how the Beta Israel acted in those Muslim-Christian conflicts of the 16th century, it would be called ከአሸናፊ ጋር የመደረብ ግዴታ, siding with the victor. So the Beta Israel were very much skillful, very much wise in trying to understand the power of balance and who to support and who to oppose at that time. So this is all that I would say, and the sources that I have consulted, and I'm consulting, of course, for this paper are, as I was mentioning previously, Taddesat Samrat's Church and State, the Chronicle of Hamad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, Stephen Kaplan's book, James Bruce Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, Pedro Page, Penbudesh Kastan Hozo, Tekles Adik Nakoya, Frederick J. Simons, Tariq Anagest, James Quinn's book, Galaudius' Chronicle, Job Ludolfus' History of Ethiopia, and several others. Thank you for listening to me. Bye.
Well, we'll proceed to our next speaker. Solomon Gebreus Beyene is here. Right, I see you. Good evening. So we'll just move on to our next presenter, Solomon Gebreus Beyene. Dr. Solomon Gebreus Beyene, his specialty is Ge'ez philology, and also is interested in medieval and modern Ethiopian history. He holds BA and MA degrees in history from Addis Ababa University and a PhD degree from the University of Hamburg in Ethiopian Studies. Since he completed his PhD thesis, Solomon published a number of publications, among them articles on various topics, including the royal historiography, medieval history of Ethiopia, and digital humanities. Currently, He is a principal investigator at the Center for Ethiopian Eritrean Studies in Hamburg University. Solomon will speak today about representations of the history of Beta Israel in the Royal Chronicle of King King Sarta Dengel in the second half of the 16th century, a historical commentary. Please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moderator, for your kind introduction. As is shown here today, I'm going to present representation of the history of Israel, Ethiopian Jews, the Royal Chronicle of King Sarta and a historical commentary. So the Chronicle of King Sarta is one of the most important works of historiography in medieval Ethiopian literature. It was written during the king's reign by a contemporary royal chronicler who attended the king's campaigns and daily royal banquet of the royal mobile court. It covers the 34-year reign of King Sarta, who was an able political and military leader of the Christian kingdom. This chronicle contains 9 chapters. 9 chapters from chapter 1 to 7 narrate events from 1563 to 1579. These chapters provide details of King Sarta early life and the internal power rivalry and rebellion with the royal family, the king's struggle to consolidate power and the victory against his power contenders, the continuous confrontation of the Christian kingdom against the overriding and expansion of the Oromo people, the continuous military campaign of the king against powerful rival to northern provinces to build a strong Christian empire in the wake of the turbulent Christian-Muslim conflict in the 16th century. In chapter 8, it recounts the interreligious war of the Christian kingdom against Beta Israel. The second military expedition to Beta Israel also described in chapter 9. This chronicle was edited and published in 1907 by Carlo Conte Rossini based on 3 manuscripts and translated into French. The text edited by Conte Rossini was then translated into English by Huntingford in 1976, into Russia by Chernestov in 1984, into Amharic by Ramu Haile in 1907. Before Conte Rossini's edition was available, 2 scholarly studies were made on this chronicle. Joseph Halve chronicle that deal with the religious history of Beta Israel, transcription of the last 2 chapters of the text from Ge'ez and translated into Hebrew based on the manuscript preserved in the Bibliothèque National Library, cataloged by Zotenberg in 1884. Another scholar, Romani scholar, Mario Sanio, also conducted a comprehensive analysis of the style and the content of this chronicle in 1892. It is true that there are 5 other manuscripts that were not included in this edition. As a result, the edition I'm preparing is built based on 8 manuscripts, namely the 3 manuscripts used by Conte Rossini, as you have seen here, and the 5 other manuscripts in order to produce a text closer to the original and to translate into English with annotation. So during the process of collating the 8 manuscripts, I was able to notice the fact that there are 2 versions of the second military expedition against Beta Israel, which I would like to present. It is common for royal chronicles of Ethiopia Christian kingdom to focus overwhelmingly on the king's achievement and victories. There are a few cases, however, which historiography actually tells the story of the people. In this context, the history of Israel has received much attention in the chronicle, which offers very valuable and substantive information for reconstructing the history of these people. In fact, in the last 100 years, the chronicle has provided historians with a wealth of information about the history of these people. In this regard, the history of the Beth Israel, primarily their confrontation with the Christian kingdom, is narrated in 2 chapters of the chronicle, chapter 8 and chapter 9. However, the division of this chapter may vary between manuscripts, which I will discuss later. The chronicle indeed generally recounts the story of Israel, which is called the story of Yehud, with 2 main military campaigns led by the Christian king. The first military expedition was conducted against Israel in 1580 because the Israel chief Radai refused to pay tribute to the king. According to the chronicler, who also mocked Radai's disobedience, the king at that time gave up the fight against the Oromo expansion, saying that we must first fight the enemies of Jesus and led a campaign against Israel. In the view of many historians who have meticulously evaluated the king's reign, including Merid, Abir, and Professor Kaplan, this was a mistake that cost the kingdom and the people a decade. The chronicler seemed to have treated the story fairly in this chapter. Israel defeated the king's army in their first confrontation. However, later, because the military power was incomparable between the two, the king's armies were numerous and better armed, and the Beth Israel could not resist any longer. As the Beth Israel became aware that they could no longer fight the king's army, they attempt to resolve the conflict through negotiation and offer reconciliation. A long correspondence between Abba Nawai, the king's representative, and Radai led the reconciliation. Interestingly, both parties agreed to do the mahalla, which is a Giz word and also Amharic word, a swear according to their religious tradition in order for reconciliation to succeed. Abba Nawai swore with the Gospel of Christians, while Radai swore with the Old Testament Orit. Eventually, he submitted to the king and wasn't taken to prisoner. The king army went up into the mountain and destroyed the religious center of Beth Israel. They built their own churches. However, this did not stop resistance for long. One of Radai's brothers rebelled against the king in 1583, and was easily crushed by the king's forces. This was the king's first campaign, as briefly summarized in the chronicle. As
Dr. Bayene?
Yes.
Just a second. Do you want to change your presentation? Did you change the page you are showing us?
No, just let me.
Okay.
As discussed in the above, in the chronicle of King's military campaign, the purpose of the summary is to have given an overview for presentation. But the main purpose of the presentation to show the second military campaign, where it appears in 2 versions of the chronicle. What was written first about the history of Beth Israel, since the chronicler seems sympathetic to the Beth Israel in his writing. I think that this note did not please the people of the court. Before looking at the details of the 2 versions of the story of the king's second campaign to Beth Israel, I will first summarize the second military campaign very briefly. The second military expedition was conducted against the people of Beth Israel, which indeed the text referred them as Falasha, in some cases Yehud, in 1587. As the chronicler referred, in the 24th year of the reign of the king, when the then Beth Israel leader Gosh rebelled against the king. In the campaign, the most powerful generals of King Sarsalingal were involved, including Yonael, Daragot, and others. From Beth Israel's side, though the chronicler only mentions the name of the leaders Gosh and Gideon, it can be understandable there were a number of patriotic fighters of Beth Israel were also involved who were determined to die for their religion and identity, who sometimes tried to escape, were persecuted in public. This second campaign was a very bloody and ferocious situation for both of the warring parties, as is detailed in the account of the chronicle. The king's army also suffered to withstand the climatic condition of the famine, where Beth Israel stationed also from hunger and thirsty. The two versions of the story of the second campaign are preserved among 8 witnesses of the manuscript of the chronicle. The manuscript Oxford, as you have seen, 1 witness of the chronicle. And the other manuscript is also, the other 5 manuscripts also kept in Bibliothèque National Library. These 2 are the first version B, version A, and the other 6 manuscript Zotom catalog by Zotenberg in 1877 is also another witness of the manuscript. So generally, the second campaign of the chronicle is written in 2 versions. The first version is shared by 2 manuscripts, manuscript Oxford and manuscript in the Bibliothèque National Library. As I have carefully studied the content of the 2 stories, they have a similar chronology of narration and literary style, which indicates that the text may have originally been written by one author, then Sassan another time, with the text that was more pleasing to the Christian kings. Censorship may be directly related to the history of Israel as well as other factors. I'm going to explore further owing to the relevance to this matter. One of the religious views of Israel focused primarily on Saint Mary, that's clearly depicted in the version of Group A, but Group B does not seem to be enthusiastic about including it in the text, assuming that would diminish the significance of Mary. The text in Group A, as you have seen here, version also seems sympathetic, neutral towards the patriotism, religious devotion of Israel, whereas the Group B text systematically omit and emphasize the greatness of the king and the soldier in second military campaign. This can be clearly seen in the selected passage. Following, I will discuss a few passages which are directly taken from the chronicle about the history of Israel. The first passage I am selected, I quote here, I will not read the this part, simply I will read the English part. The first passage is the one about Saint Mary. What says, to their prophet, a lying prophet whom he had assigned to kill him last, he said, if you want to live, you must beg me by invoking the name of Mary, otherwise the sword is before you. Is it not? Then the prophet from the Jewish prophet replied to him that, is it not forbidden to mention the name of Mary? If I die, it will be good for me, because I will leave the land of lies for the land of truth, the darkness for the light. Hence, be in a hurry to kill me. Yonael said to him, since you have chosen to die rather than to live, I will beautify your death. Bend your head, and he bent his neck, struck with a sword. With one blow, he cut off his head and broke both his knees. The point of the sword going through his neck and knees sank to the ground as this past palm. And the part that penetrated the ground broke. Those who watched were amazed at the strength of the executioner and the courage of the Jew who went to his death, despising the things of this world and adorning himself with the things of heaven. The text clearly reveals how the Israel were devoted to their religion. The prophet, even if his neck was in the sword, he would rather die than plea Yonael, who offered to beg for Mary's name. Indeed, the text also continues that the chronicler appreciated the devotion to the religion of the prophet, but he added that this was of no value after the introduction of Christianity. On the other hand, it's surprising that the above passage is completely omitted in the other version of the story, Group B, shared by O and A manuscripts. It avoids the story of this ardent martyr Israel, whose name is unknown indeed. Even the scribe of Group A afraid to mention his name, except saying that he is the false prophet. It's definitely his name might have been known in the court. Group B report only the part of the text where feeling Israel soldiers were persecuted in public, offer the Jewish prophet to beg him on the name of Mary, and he responds that he did not believe in Mary and martyrdom in public. This point that was carefully and deliberately censored in the second version. Rather, the version of Group B tells a miracle of Mary performed for the king. Indeed, it seems in response to the first author who composed what he saw, but unanimously teach in his writing the theological concept of Judaism on Saint Mary.
Solomon, please, you have 5 more minutes. Okay.
The scribe of the text manuscript OA composed the story that the king won the victory over Israel through the support of Mary. The two versions also clear variation representing the patriotism of Israel leader. Once the troops of the Christianity were mounted on the mountain where Gosh hid himself, controls the area. In the final hour of the reader, Gosh, when death is inevitable to him, before he threw himself into the cliffs, there is an interesting point that has been recounted in the Group A version of the chronicle. Like the prophet, as the first recounts, Gosh preferred death that he said in his word rather than surrendering to the Christian, which indeed inspired his wife and daughter and other members of the community to take the martyrdom. This text is completely missing Group B. For better understanding, I quote the mistake referring to the direct word of Gosh. Then he decides of losing body and his soul rather than to bow down myself to the king and surrender to the hands of Christians. It's better for me to die. After he counseled and he went with his family to the bank of the cliff and they fell near the camp of Blaine. Let me conclude briefly. The story of Israel in the 6th century seemed to have been a point of contention in the royal court of the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, as you have seen in the 2 versions of the text above. As discussed with King's first campaign, we do not find 2 versions. All manuscripts have similar content. So why was the account of the second campaign subject to censorship? Royal historiography, it was customary for the chronicler to write during the day and read at night before the king and the dignitaries of the court. The royal chronicler who wrote down the king's second campaign against Israel in 1587, whose name is not known to us, seemed to have written down what he saw and read before the court banquet. But what he wrote may have been displeased the dignitaries of the royal court and perhaps religious figures as well. Since the second campaign, fierce fighting between the warring party, it was not as easy as the first campaign for the Christian king to crush Israel forces. So the author gives a fair account of the challenges faced by the Christian troops and the king in the second campaign. Also, the chronicler attempts to depict the devoutness of those political and religious leaders of Israel who died for their faith and identity, sometimes in martyrdom. As the Christian kingdom saw itself as savior of Christianity, it was unlikely to accept the historical text describing the devotion, dedication of fervent believers, which prompted doubts about Mary's position as one of the most prominent figures in Orthodox Christianity. In contrast, royal history tends to favor Christianity and downplay other religions. It's certain that the first version, Group A, contains several points that fell outside the frame of Christian teaching, which is unusual in the court historiography. The writer of this version seems to appreciate the devotee martyr of Israel at the time. I noticed as editor, I edited this text that this variant reading with factual discrepancies and alternation for political reasons could not be resolved by a critical edition, as we would in philological practice by picking a true reading and noting the variant in apparatus. Here it is impossible to drop one of the two texts. It's almost entirely two texts, both of which I will edit in the parallel apparatus. In the future, historian will have to carefully examine, compare and contrast the account of travelers and other relevant oral tradition of Israel that relate to the fact in one of the two versions. In version A of the text, we see, for example, Goshen and Gideon are described as Israel leader.
Conclude now.
Yeah.
Please conclude.
Devoted to their religion and identity, whereas in version B, they were cowardly and trembled for the power of the king and died or escaped unanimously. They were described as being Jewish cowards. Referring to other sources, studying the oral history of Israel communities can resolve these questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and that shows us how much we can learn from one chronicle with two versions for the same event, historical event. So it was very, very interesting. And now, do we have some questions? Maybe one, you can ask either in English or you can write in Hebrew in the chat, and I will translate it for Solomon, okay?
אפשר גם לשאול אותו באמהרית, זה בסדר.
בבקשה.
אם יש אפשר לקבל את המצגת, יכול טוב. לא אותה, כי לא ראינו את כל המצגת.
No, it didn't have any, זה מה שהיה לו.
מה, הדף ראשון וזהו, ראיתי שם 18 דפים יש לו.
Solomon, someone is asking if you had only one page of your presentation, if you had any other
the slides.
Slides.
The slides.
Only one, right?
No, I have.
You did. So we didn't see it.
Not necessarily. I thought.
Maybe, Solomon, maybe you send it later to Elad, and
yes.
Elad will put it for everybody later to see. Okay? We'll be able, אנחנו נוכל לראות את הכנס מוקלט, וגם המצגות אפשר יהיה לראות, ואחר כך אפשר יהיה לראות את המצגת. Elad, is it okay with you?
Yes.
Okay, so you send it to Elad, and later we all can watch it, okay? בסדר. So any question for Dr. Gebreus, please?
I do want to ask him, if Gideon start with in Infaz area, Gideon የጀመረ ከኢንፍራዝ አካባቢ ነው ወይንም አይደለም? בעברית? קיבלתם את השאלה שלי? በአማርኛ የጠየቅኩትን አልገባችሁም?
ገብቶኛል። በአማርኛ ልመልስልሽ በእንግሊዘኛ?
Okay. No, Solomon, you can translate the question to English and then answer in English.
Okay,
please.
I think she asked me that where was the royal camp of Sartsadingle was stationed according to the chronicle.
Okay.
I think the Malet I will answer to her in Amharic and then I will come to English again. እህቴ ትሰሚኛለሽ?
እሰማለሁ።
በመካከለኛው ዘመን የኢትዮጵያ ታሪክ ውስጥ ከጎንደር ነገስታት በፊት ነገስታቶቹ ቋሚ ከተማ ወይ መናገሻ የላቸውም። ከአንድ ወደ አንድ ቦታ እየተንቀሳቀሱ እየሰፈሩ ሀገሩንና ህዝቡን ነበር የሚያስተዳድሩት እና አብዛኛው ጊዜ እነ ዘርዓ ያዕቆብ እነ በአደ ማርያም ገላውዲዮስ የመሳሰሉት የመካከለኛው ዘመን የኢትዮጵያ ታሪክ የሰፍረው የሚገኙበት ሸዋና ዙሪያው ነበር። ሰርጸ ድንግል ግን ጉባኤ ነው ጉባኤ የሚባል ጎንደር ውስጥ ጉባኤ የሚባል ቦታ ነበር አብዛኛውን ጊዜ ያሰፈረው ከዛም በኋላ ወደ ፍራንስ ሄዷል ነገር ግን ወደ ቤተ እስራኤል የተደረጉ ጦርነቶች ሁለቱ ጦርነቶችን ዜና እንደሚያስቀምጠው ከጉባኤ ነው የተነሳው እና ጉባኤ ተነስቶ
okay now we had a chance.
I think she has asked me an interesting question.
No, we are not going to have more discussion in Amharic.
Okay.
No. Any question in English or Hebrew?
למה שלא ידבר אמהרית?
מפני שאני לא מבינה אמהרית.
לא, הוא רוצה להגיד את זה באנגלית.
This conference is being conducted in 2 languages, in Hebrew and in English. The next conference, maybe it will be different, but this is how we are doing it this evening, okay?
I would like to hear his response in English.
Yeah, he can also translate into English the Amharic version, you know. You should give him a chance.
עוד שאלה. Okay, so it was very interesting, fascinating, and
let's give the chance for also for Ethiopians, maybe if they can ask me in Amharic, and then I'll reply to.
No, I'll tell you. We have exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes.
በጣም ጥሩ ነው እንጂ በአማርኛ ሲወራ እንዴ
אלעד אתה מסכים לשינוי לשאלה אחת באמהרית שאנחנו לא מבינים כלום?
I have no problem with Amharic, but just he wanted to translate his question.
אבל זה לא פייר לכל האנשים האחרים שמשתתפים.
אבל הוא עולה לתרגם
הוא רוצה להגיד את התשובה באנגלית.
אלא אם כן הוא יתרגם באנגלית.
הוא רוצה לתרגם את הרגע.
אני חושב זה אחד מההזדמנויות שגם נשמע אותו באמהרית.
Okay, but just a second.
እንግሊዘኛና አማርኛ አብሮ ከተካሄደ ምን ችግር አለ?
በጣም እጅግ በጣም እንትን የሚያስደንቅ ስለሆነ በአማርኛ ብንሰማም በጣም ደስ የሚል ነው።
Okay, let me say one word for those of you who read Amharic text. I will share the chronicle is already translated to Amharic. And if you share me your email and social medias, and then I will share you in email, and then you read everything in Amharic.
So, Solomon, this is a very, very nice proposal, and I think you can give it to Elad, and Elad will share it with everyone who is interested to read it in Amharic.
Dr. Bayana, just a second. There was a request that you'll translate your previous answer to English.
הכרוניקות רשומות נמצאים אצלי בספר הגדעונים, דניאל בלטה.
Dr. Bayana, can you translate your previous answer to English for those of us who don't speak Amharic, please?
סליחה, אלעד.
שיתרגם לאנגלית את התשובה הקודמת שלו, וזהו.
אבל זה כבר יהיה תשובה של 10 דקות.
No.
It doesn't. We're missing one of our speakers, so we have extra time. And my presentation is very short.
Can you do it? But
sure.
Do it in summarize what you said. Your answer in Amharic, the previous answer. Summarize it in English, please.
We can't hear you.
You should open your microphone.
Open your mic.
Okay.
Good.
I think she asked me just one question, but generally, this chronicle is very important and valuable historical source for understanding understanding widely the history of Israel, which are represented as Falasha, sometimes Ayod. The two terms are interchangeably used in this chronicle. So, where was exactly Sarsadingal was in Gondar areas? Gubai was one of the most important where the royal court was stationed, and then so many campaigns were led. Sarsadingal led almost 9 military campaigns at different times. The other 7 campaigns were not related at all to the Beit Israel, but 2 crucial military campaigns to Beit Israel. One is, as I've said, in 1580 and 1579, and the other is in 1586. Mainly, you know, of course, in the 16th century, during that time, the Oromo was also expanding from south to north. And Sarsadingal took a bad decision. He claimed that I have to give priority for the enemies of Jesus, you know, quote unquote, the enemies of Jesus represented for the Farashas and Besra in the Chronicle, and he led a campaign to them. And in the first confrontation, military confrontation, they were successful. Later, the number of the troops were numerous and better armed the king kills, and they were defeated. Surprisingly, they resolved their problem through negotiation, mahalla. They swore, Abanawai was one of the most important representatives of King Sarsadingal, and Radai, both of them, Radai brought Orit, and Abanawai brought Mazhab Quddus, Old New Testament. Both of them, they swore, and they get reconciliation. At that time, they don't need judge, they don't need court. Simply, both of them, they respect each other. And the first military confrontation was relatively resolved through negotiation, and Radai was taken to prison. The second military campaign, which was conducted as Professor dealt it in his valuable books, and in 1587, which the Chronicle clearly states that in the 24 years of King Sarsan, it was very bloody. And, you know, the Besra are also very strong. They fought until days. Gosh did not want to surrender. And finally, Gosh and his family, including his wife and sister, rather than surrendering themselves to the Christians, and they throw away themselves into the cliff from Samin Mountain, and they committed suicide. That was the bloody in the second version. Okay. But my idea is the second military campaign was, when I have looked and closely studied the Chronicle, it appears in 2 versions. The first version was, the first version appears in the first version shared by 2 manuscripts, Odlea Library manuscript and another manuscript that Jajamash Hailu. And the other 6 manuscripts, which are descended from Hailu collection, others, they have different story. So why we find 2 different stories in second military campaign? This was a very serious question, and I have identified the first version try to be, try to be neutral, try to see the history of Israel fairly. It appreciates the religious devotion and also the patriotism. But whereas the other version undermine in everything. So there is a political and religious ideology that forced the royal court to censor the first version. So this is the point. And the censorship was done in order to undermine the religious views and motives of Israel, which is not appreciated in the royal court. Maybe the royal chronicle, I don't know why the royal chronicler is unusual in Ethiopian historiography. He was inclined and he was very enthusiastic to Beth Israel. He might have been also blood relation with Beth Israel. I don't know. But
okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
This is the first version.
Solomon, now that we all understood, it was very, very interesting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, now we can go to our the next presentation today, and I think many of us know and familiar with the work of Professor Stephen Kaplan, and he will speak about Yaakov, a Christian emperor with Beta Israel roots. I think we heard the talks. He was mentioned, and now we learn some more about him from Professor Stephen Kaplan, who is the Gail Levin, the new chair of comparative religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was educated at Brandeis University, Harvard Divinity School, and the Hebrew University. He has been a visiting professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, Harvard University, Boston University, and Hamburg University. He has published extensively on the social and religious history of Ethiopian, particularly on the Orthodox Church and on Beta Israel. He has also published on the Ethiopian diaspora. Please, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I can already say I'm having some problem with my share screen. I sent my matzeget, my PowerPoint ahead, so if it can be shown, it's fairly simple, so it's not crucial. Very good. Okay, great.
I can see it.
Great. Okay, very good. Let me begin by thanking the Let me begin by apologizing to the translator. I will read from my text, but here and there I will.
One moment. I want to remind us all that you have the interpretation sign, the globe, סימן של הגלובוס. You can, and from there you can get to the Hebrew. Those of you who joined and you don't know that we have interpretation to Hebrew. So please go on. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. As I say, I apologize to the translator. I will stick as closely as I can to my text. I want to congratulate the organizers of this conference for this initiative, particularly for choosing a topic which does not focus on either the origins of the Beit Israel or their relationship to the Jewish world, but rather on a specific historical period. Similarly, the mythic aspects of Beit Israel lore have garnered far more attention than hard historical facts. Thus, the Queen of Sheba and her evil twin Judith are much better known than the subject of my talk today, the half Beit Israel Emperor Yaakov and his Beit Israel born mother Harago, who bore at least 4 sons who were involved in Ethiopian court life. One other word, Bar apologized that he has children in the house. I have children, 3 dogs, birds, and fish, and the only ones I can guarantee will be quiet are the tropical fish. So I apologize if there are any interruptions. In the discussion that there was between the second and third session, it occurred to me that Yaakov, who I'm talking about, could be anachronistically be said to be Jewish through matrilineal descent, and had he had the opportunity, would have been to make Aliyah today. However, my focus will not be on looking at his status in law, but rather his history, real and in some cases imagined. Let me say that I'm going to present relatively little that is new today. Could you put up the second slide? All right, this is his dates. As you can see, it coincides with the period our previous speaker was talking about. Think about just for a second that in the midst of these wars with the Beit Israel, Tsar Sedengel has a Beit Israel wife, I'll talk more about her in a minute, who is bearing him Beit Israel or half Beit Israel children. As I was saying, I'm not going to say a great deal that is tremendously new today. My remarks are based on my own work. Next slide, please. Based on my book from 30 years ago. In the middle there, James Quirin's marvelously detailed book in which he draws on oral histories gathered 50 years ago in Ethiopia, and I hope someone can find out where he has stored those and maybe get them for the Institute for the Preservation of Ethiopian Jewish Culture. The article by my colleague and friend, Leonardo Cohen, in the Encyclopedia Ethiopica on Jacob. And next slide, please. An article on dynastic marriage and the Beit Israel by the late Richard Pankhurst, who was one of the great scholars and advocates for Ethiopian culture. Since all the sources are in English, or the primary sources are in Amharic, Gez, or Portuguese, they remain largely unknown outside of scholarly circles. I'm very happy to be able to present in English today. As many of you know, my native language is Ivrit Kala, is Hebrew. But I indicated I could present either in English or in Hebrew, and the longer I'm living in the United States, the easier it is to stick with the English. And it's a real pleasure to, I'm sorry that the internet connection with Gondor didn't work out, but it's a real pleasure to be presenting with Ethiopian colleagues, and especially from Hamburg, where I spent many summers working with my colleagues there. That the fact that this will be translated into Hebrew is a real bonus, since it is much less known. Now, one of the points I want to stress today is that many aspects of Jacob's story touch upon themes which appear throughout Ethiopian history. Jacob was born in 1587 to one of the wives, next slide please, of the Emperor Sarsadengel, who we just heard about. Harago, or Haragwe, was of Beit Israel origin. She bore the honorific princess, which was commonly used to refer to a mother of the ruler's children who was not his primary wife. According to some traditions, she was a sister of the Beit Israel ruler Gideon. As an anthropologist famously said, they are our enemies, we marry them. It was very common in Ethiopia for this to take place, as I'll show in a second. The Jesuits viewed her as a concubine, but since 4 of her sons were at one time deeply involved in the secession process, this designation would appear to greatly underestimate her influence, even if it reflects her formal position. Her marriage to Sarsadengel may well have been part of an attempted political alliance between the ruler and the Beit Israel, which might seem hard to believe given a lot of heard today. From what we know,
what is this?
We know that this was common. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Eleni, who was a major figure throughout much of the late 15th and early 16th century, was the daughter of the Muslim ruler of Hadia. She converted to Christianity and married the Ethiopian emperor. Because she was very long-lived, she was still a figure at the court in the time of Lebna Dengel in the early decades of the 16th century. If you consider what relations were between Muslims and Christians at that time, the fact that the emperor would marry a Muslim leader's daughter is significant. At the same time, according to Francisco Alvarez, the Emperor Naod, who also reigned in the beginning of the 16th century, had around a half dozen wives chosen from the neighboring Muslim principalities. Given the tense relations between Ethiopian Christians and local Muslims, again, a remarkable pairing. Much later, towards the end of the Gondor period, next slide, please, the Emperor Yasu II, who lived in the 18th century, married Wobit, the daughter of an Oromo leader. Their son, Yoas, who became emperor, brought many of his Oromo kings to the court. Therefore, the presence of a Beit Israel wife at the court at the time when the emperor was fighting against the Beit Israel perhaps not as unusual as we might think. Whatever her official status, Harago gained importance because she had 4 sons. Sarsa Dengel's primary wife, Mariam Sena, only had daughters. Initially, Sarsa Dengel appears to have hoped, no, that's fine, you can stay on that slide. Appears to have hoped that a nephew, Za Dengel, would have been his heir. But when he was presented by his son, Za Mariam, a child of Harago, he appears to have favored this boy and largely excluded his nephew from the court. Numerous courtiers played along with this change, but then Zar Mariam died. Za Dengel was once again the heir apparent. However, when Sarsa Dengel died, the Empress Mariam Sena and her relatives conspired to place the obviously more pliable Yaakov, who was then only 9 or 10 years old, on the throne. And this is a pattern we find in various periods in Ethiopian history, where courtiers get together to place officially on the throne a young heir who is clearly not capable of ruling, so that the people in the court around him can obviously run things. When Yaakov finally reached an age at which he could claim authority, his court supporters balked at this assertion of independence. He was accused of being a heretic, having broken a cross, having used Oromo divination techniques, being a sexual deviant, and not actually being the son of Sarsa Dengel. The use of charges of religious apostasy, or at least deviance, to overthrow a ruler was also a recurring theme in Ethiopian political history. Next slide, please. As we've discussed, Sosanius in the coming years converted to Catholicism and was deposed because he had left the church. Slide after that, please. Much later, Yasu V, or as he was called, Lij Yasu, was stripped of power in a coup on the Christian holiday of Maskal and excommunicated under the still disputed claim that he had accepted Islam. His father, who was born a Muslim, had married one of Menelich's, the Emperor Menelich's daughters. While there is no reason to believe that Yaakov was in any way an observant Beit Israel, his connection to his religious ethnic community was raised by those who wished to oppose him. In one of the more interesting comments on the wars between the Beit Israel and the Ethiopian emperors, there appears to be an attempt to claim that Yaakov allowed the Beit Israel ruler to escape when he was defeated in battle. And the chronicler goes to lengths to try and explain that he didn't let him escape on purpose. It was not that he was helping out his relative. Finally, the defection of various military units led to Yaakov's downfall. Rather surprisingly, Yaakov was not executed, but sent into exile. Next slide, please. Okay, okay. You see Zal Mariam, the brother of Yaakov, who never arose the throne. Za Dengel, for the third time, was put forward as the heir to the throne. This is Sarsa Dengel's nephew. He was finally elevated to the throne, but his reign was brief because in the course of military action, he died or was killed. Yaakov, by then, was close to 20 years old and surprisingly was restored to the throne. Next slide, please. Oh, no, you can leave on, she can leave on, okay, fine, that's fine. So you see his dates, okay? He was on the throne, he was deposed, he returns to the throne. He sought to consolidate his position, but in early 1607, he was defeated and died in battle against Sosanius and his allies. Next slide. Two more of Harago's sons by Sarsa Dengel. There was two more half-Beit Israel sons, Kifla Mariam and Makato, briefly attempted to challenge the new emperor. They attempted to organize forces, many of whom were in Simeon, were not successful. They were captured and executed. Thus, in the last years of the 16th century and the first years of the 17th century, no fewer than 4 men of Beit Israel descent were selected for or attempted to seize the throne of Ethiopia. However, this is not the end of Jacob's story. Next slide, please. In 1608, the recently crowned Susenyos was confronted by a rival who claimed to be the presumably dead Jacob. Once again, it's possible to find historical parallels to this claim, if not in Ethiopia, elsewhere. At almost the same time, next slide, please. At almost the same time in Russia, a figure appeared named Dmitri, who claimed to be the son of Ivan the Terrible. This pretender was so charismatic that he eventually ascended the Russian throne, but his policies led to his overthrow and assassination. 2 other Dmitris reached the throne as well. Much later, next slide. Much later, of course, there were several cases of women claiming to be the late Tsar's daughter, Anastasia, with the hope that the Romanovs could be returned to the throne. And if this all seems like something from far away and the distant past, final slide, please. I would remind you that there are thousands, if not millions, of Americans today who believe that the deceased son of John Kennedy, the president, John Kennedy Jr., is alive and well and sending coded messages to his followers, waiting for his return to power. To return to Ethiopia. And was able to raise a considerable following. It took the governor of the province about a year to seize and execute this Jacob. However, even this was not the end of the story. In 1724, a rebel calling himself Heskias arose, claiming not to be, of course, Jacob, who by this time would have been 140 years old, but to be his son. Simple math would indicate that if Jacob died in 1607, his son would have to be at least 60 years old. 15 years after that, yet another pretender arose, claiming descent from Jacob and trying to achieve the throne. In conclusion, the first decades of the 17th century were a momentous period in Beit Israel history. As most of our speakers today have discussed, the wars between the Beit Israel and successive Ethiopian emperors were at their peak and eventually culminated with the loss of Beit Israel autonomy and independence, and the establishment of a royal capital in Gondar. At the same time, perhaps less dramatically, the Beit Israel had a notable part in the succession struggles of the period. Jacob and his brothers represent an undervalued episode in Beit Israel history. Almost certainly, this is because they did not fit aspects of the accepted narrative and the conflict with the Christian emperors. Emma Bet Haragu and her sons were remarkable figures and clearly deserve more attention than they have garnered to this point. Thank you very much. Toda rabba.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Really interesting, and it tells also something about human nature. How people are attached to figures and that become not only a myth, but the wish to react the same personality or the same myth that are attached to this person. I know from my field of research about messiahs, contenders who died, and a few years later, some people came and presented themselves as the true Messiah. In my across the Red Sea in Yemen, where I am working. So this is very interesting, and the character of Yaakov is really fascinating. And thank you very much.
Thank you,
Steve. And now we can take some questions. Solomon, בבקשה, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor, for your fascinating presentation. I think your presentations offers me interesting insight to have a look the royal historiography and also this base trial, the base trial in the end of in the last period of Sarsadingle. I think the beta trials were involved to the court, the Christian kingdom, not only through marriage, rather even I understand they influenced the royal historiography. When I have closely looked at the two versions, the second version was revised in around the period of Yaakov, around 605 or 607, before the coming of Susunion into power. Because this the version which appreciate the patriotism, the religious devotion of Beth Israel appear in the text, which also consulted by Petro Payash. Payash in historical book, he referred the first the version which appreciates the Beth Israel in his book, which completed in 622. So the first version already existed, maybe correlates with the period of Yaakov, which was a golden period for Beth Israel, I think, even in the royal court.
No, the comment you made about the historiography at the end of your talk, I hadn't really thought about it, but the idea that there were four sons, but that there were others, which of course makes this whole period of these wars much more complex than we would have thought if there were actually Beit Israel also in the court.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any other comment or question?
Yeah, I have one comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's...
to Steve. Yeah, Steve. Thank you for your interesting and nice presentation. But I want to ask you one thing. It's not related to this lecture of yours. As you know now, the generation growing up in Israel is, how do you say, they are dislocated from the language and culture, and most of them are now speakers of, becoming speakers of Hebrew. Yeah, I'm also, I tell to some of my students at Tel Aviv University, while I was also in Hebrew University, to study an additional language. If they speak only Hebrew, their knowledge will be limited only in Israel. They can't do research. They can't present at international level, etc. Let's put that aside. Yeah, I will urge the younger generation, to study English, or it can be also German, another language, to expand their worldly view, to present their findings, etc. But for the time being, are you thinking, for example, with another researchers who dealt with Ethiopian Jews, to let's say translate at least some of your important works into Hebrew, so that it can be accessible to the younger generation? Because we don't have choice, for the time being, they can refer to the Hebrew translation, and then we can inculcate them, to, how do you say, to develop the linguistic ability to read also other languages, etc.
Okay. Look at, as we all know, the economics of translating books from English into Hebrew, somebody has to subsidize something like this. I don't think it's ever the author who says, no, don't translate the book. The problem is, that the institutions that are interested in that, that will look and say, well, it's a scholarly book. People who do scholarship should be able to read English, even though we know that that's not the reality. I'll be a little bit cynical here and say that the fact that the book and many of my publications are only in English has not prevented people from forming opinions about them, even if they only read Hebrew. So take that for what it is. One point that I also wanted to add, just somewhat connects to the previous discussion with Solomon, because you mentioned the thing of translation and languages. It's interesting. When I presented, I don't know if it was a year ago, for the Merkaz Lemoreshet, Mariam Sana, Sarsa Dengel's wife, who I mentioned, commissioned a version of the Orit, which is largely based upon a Hebrew text. And one of the questions is, where did they get that copy from? I spoke about that, as I say, a year ago when I talked about Jewish influences in Ethiopia. So there's another layer of things going on in the court during this period, because at the same time as Sarsa Dengel is fighting against the Gideonites and he has a Beit Israel wife, somebody in the royal court has access to a Hebrew version of the Orit and is translating it into Gez, or revising the translation on the basis of that.
Very interesting. Do we have any other last question? Okay.
Leonardo is wanting
אנחנו מנסים...
Dr. Leonardo Cohen wants to ask a question.
Okay. Please.
Leonardo?
Can I ask?
Leo, you want to ask?
Yes.
Okay, בבקשה.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. I am happy also not just to talk with you, but also to see you. I wanted to ask you about, there was the first Jacob and the second Jacob that wanted to take the throne of Susenyos in 1608.
Right.
So it is more or less the same story about the Jewish heritage, or it's completely a different person?
Okay, you mean the pseudo Jacob? You're talking about the
it was
who's claiming to be Jacob.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it's not clear whether he's if he's claiming, he's putting the whole genealogy there, in terms of it. He's claiming to be this, obviously dead former ruler, who everyone clearly knows his background. I mean, you could argue that in, the 18th century, when people appear claiming to be Jacob, he's some mythical figure.
Yeah.
In this case, where it's so soon afterwards, everyone must be aware of who he's claiming to be. Why, again, without getting, into the discussions, as in a previous session came up with a question about modern politics, why this particular Jacob tries to get support in Tigray is an interesting question. I mean, as opposed to Jacob's, actual brothers, who we can sort of understand why they appear in Simeon trying to get support. It's harder to understand why this, pretend Jacob appears in Tigray, though given everything we know about the Gondar region and the Tigray regions, we can speculate, but that may be, injecting the present into the past.
Okay.
לא חושב שהתשובה מספקת אותי, אני חייב להודות. כי גם באזור תיגראי היו גם חלק מהדמויות, באזורים מאוד ספציפיים. חבריי בטח יודעים את זה, וכמובן באזור סימיין, אבל גם באזור תיגראי. מבחינתי, מתקבל על הדעת.
לא ברור לי בדיוק למה אתה מתכוון. בראשית המאה ה-17, בטיגריה, למה אתה מתכוון?
חלק מבני המלוכה, או ההנחה שבאותו צד, זאת אומרת, באזור הצד טיגריי, ששם יש פחות מלוכה, ויותר בחלק, הצורך או הרצון שלו, שהוא קיבל את התמיכה מאזור טיגריי, זה היה נראה לך לא סביר, והיה יותר סביר זאת הנחה שאני לא מקבל אותה, כי חלקנו, יש לנו משפחות, שאנחנו סופרים אחורה 19 דורות, או 29 דורות, גם בצד של טיגריי, אז כאילו, אני לא יודע מאיפה הטענה שלו.
בסדר, אבל כאן מדובר באיש שמופיע, שכתוב במקורות שהוא מופיע, והוא מקבל תמיכה, או לפחות הוא מופיע אצל הנזירים של דברה ביזן, שכפי שאנחנו יודעים, דברה ביזן הוא מנזר מאוד חשוב, בשביל תנועת נזירים נוצרים באזור טיגרה. אז ההנחה זה שהוא מופיע במנזר נוצרי, או קרוב שם, איפה שיש פילוג של הנצרות, כבר במאה ה-14-15, זאת אומרת שזה לא שהוא פונה לבית ישראל לתמיכה, אלא הוא פונה לקבוצות בטיגרה, מה עוד שהמושל של טיגרה זה מי שבסוף תופס אותו. אני מקבל את זה. האמת, אני לא יודע מספיק על ההיסטוריה של יהודי טיגרה, רוב מה שידוע לנו ידוע יחסית העת החדשה, אחרי תקופה של אבא מהרי, ואחד מהמקורות בערבית, האיש כותב על יהודים בטיגרה, במאה ה-17-16 נדמה לי, אבל הוא אומר שהרבה מהם כבר התנצרו, אבל אני אשמח ללמוד עוד על יהודי טיגרה.
תודה רבה, את החלק הזה אני בהחלט מקבל, שלא יודעים מספיק.
תודה רבה. אני חושבת שעד עכשיו היה דיון והרצאות מצוינות, ועכשיו אנחנו ננסה לעשות קשר עם דסלן, because Desalan is in Gondar, and he has a really very good, very interesting topic to talk about, and we'll try ננסה, but is Desalan in? מה שיש לנו, Desalan?
No, I think he's not with us. So sadly,
he said earlier that he would try to connect, and he did manage for a short time, but I don't think he's
able to. So we are really, really very, very sorry, because he had some very interesting things to tell us. I read his abstract, and it's really it's really fascinating. So maybe he's.
Desalan, wait a second. Someone said that he's connected. Desalan, can you hear us?
מחובר, Desalan, can you speak up? Can we hear? We want to hear you. Maybe you connect without the video, because we have here with us your presentation, and we can put it on, and this way maybe we can hear you without seeing you. Can you do this?
I think we should conclude Professor Batzion Klorman, Raki Klorman. I think we should conclude. Thank you very much. Thank you all the present. נפתלי אברהם, ואפשר בעצם לעבור לעברית. אני רוצה להזמין את נפתלי אברהם לשאת דברי סיכום, מנכ"ל המרכז למורשת יהדות אתיופיה.
ערב טוב לכולם. ראשית אני באמת רוצה להודות לכם על ההשתתפות שלכם בכנס. Desale is coming. Desale?
Hello.
Hello?
Hello, Naftali?
Yes.
Abid. Hello, Naftali.
Samayele?
Can you hear me?
أنا سامع له. أنت تسمعني؟
Hello.
Elad.
ሄሎ ደሳለኝ ቪዲዮውን አጥፋውና ፕሬዘንቴሽኑ ብቻ አቅርብ። ኦፍ አድርገው ቪዲዮ።
ደሳለኝ
I don't think we'll be able to hear his lecture. Desalegn, we'll try maybe to record your lecture, and maybe when we put it on our website, we'll have your recorded lecture, but I don't think it will work out tonight, sadly.
Yeah.
Okay?
היום יותר טוב.
כן.
אוקיי, אז אני רוצה לסכם, זהו כנס השני של מרכז מורשת שמארגן עוד בשנתיים האחרונות, ואני חושב שזה מאוד מאוד חשוב לנו להתמקד בנושאים ספציפיים, והשנה זה היה שלטון העצמי של יהודי אתיופיה, הגדעונים. ראינו כמה העניין יצר וכמה באמת הנושא הוא חשוב, גם מבחינת הקהילה וגם בכלל לחברה הישראלית, על נושא של המורשת של יהודי אתיופיה והיסטוריה ומורשת של יהודי אתיופיה. אז אני רוצה להודות קודם כל תסלחו לי, אני በመጀመሪያ ደረጃ ዛሬ ከዚህ የሳይንስ ጉባኤ መጥተው የተሳተፉት ዶክተር ደሳለኝ ብዙነህ አየለ እና ሰለሞን ገብረየስ በየነ ከዚህ መጣችሁ ስለተሳተፋችሁ በጣም ነው የማመሰግነውና እኛ እንግዲህ የእናንተና የኛ ግንኙነት እንደዚህ እንደሚቀጥል በጣም ከፍተኛ ምኞት ነው ያለኝና አመሰግናለሁ። Okay, thank you. אני רוצה להודות באמת ליושב-ראש כאן, שמחה גיטאון, לוועדה שלנו, חברי המועצה, לוועדה מדעית, וכמובן למי שארגן איתנו כאן את הכנס, לבר קריבוס, ולכל המרצים על הנושאים שהם חוקרים ובקיאים בהם. לנו זה היה מאוד מעניין ומאוד משמח שמעורבות של כולם כאן באמת להכיר מכל הזוויות את הנושא של ממלכת הגדעונים.
טלי, אלעד.
שנייה, רגע, אלעד יגיע לו גם בזמנו. וכל האנשים שבאמת הביאו איזשהו מבט אחר, כיוון אחר, שנוגע לעניין הזה שנדמה היה שזה משהו שמסופר ולא באמת נחקר, ואני חושב שהיום הערנו באמת את הזרקור על נושא חשוב זה, ואני יצאתי פה עם הרבה מאוד הבנות וידע היסטורי. אז אני ממש מודה לכם, וכמובן יש לנו כאן צוות שעובד כדי לארגן את הכנס הזה, וכמובן אלעד שהוא באמת הוביל ביחד עם דוקטור קריבוס, דוקטור אלעד וקסלר, כן? וצוות של המרכז שעבד באמת קשה כדי שהאירוע הזה יהיה איכותי, מקצועי, ומכבד את המסורת הזאת, וכך נמשיך לעשות את זה, ואני מקווה שגם באירועים שכמובן שנקיים, נמשיך לעשות נושאים שיהיו מקצועיים וכמו שצריך, ולהביא גם את המבט האחר, גם לפעמים, אם זה לא נוח לנו, אז גם אלה יהיו כאן. חלק מהוויכוח מלימוד שאנחנו רוצים לקדם כאן במרכז מורשת יהדות אתיופיה. אז אני מודה לכל יושבי ראש כאן שהיו כאן, וגם לכל החבר'ה והצוות שלי שעובדים באמת במסירות רבה. זה אני חושב שזה, אתם רואים את התוצאות, והתוצאות היו מאוד מאוד טובות. ונמשיך לעשות את זה ככה, וניפגש בכנס הבא, ותעקבו אחרינו, כי באירועים הבאים שלא ירחק עכשיו, ואנחנו ניפגש שוב בנושא אחר. ואני מודה לכל המשתתפים כאן שהשתתפו ושאלו, תעמקו, זה מאוד חשוב עבורנו, עבור כולנו, עבור כל חברה ישראלית כולה. זה תודה רבה וערב טוב.
שנייה אחת, תודה רבה. לנפתלי. יורם, אתה איתנו?
כן, אני איתכם.
אתה רוצה 20 שניות רק להגיד מה אתה עושה?
אפילו פחות. ערב טוב, אני קוראים לי יורם, אני גר באשקלון. אני מקיים אצלי בחצר אחת לכמה זמן ערבי תרבות ושיח. הערב הקרוב יהיה במוצאי שבת 29 בינואר, בשעה 7 בערב. מהמאה ה-17 אנחנו נקפוץ להיום. מיכה פלדמן יתארח אצלנו בחצר, ויספר את סיפורי עליית יהודי אתיופיה לציבור הרחב. הציבור מוזמן. יש קישור כאן בצ'אט. תודה, אלעד.
תודה רבה, יורם. אני רוצה להודות לעוד כמה אנשים, אולי אני גם אחזור על אותם אנשים שנפתלי הזכיר, אבל לוויקי הנדמן, שהייתה אחראית על השיווק ברשתות ועל הצד הטכני של הכנס, תודה רבה. למנכ"ל המרכז מר נפתלי אברהם על התמיכה וההכוונה לאורך החודשים שבהם עבדנו על הכנס, לדניאל צוקר על העזרה בניהול הזום היום לאורך הכנס, לדוקטור שמחה גטהון על ההכוונה והעצות שהעניקה לאורך הדרך, לאבשלום גרנק על עבודת יחסי הציבור, לכל שאר עובדי המרכז, לאביטל זרקוביאן, לזיווה מקוננדגו, גתי גטה, מלכה, יוסי מנגיסטו, תמר גרדן וישעיהו צ'אנה. אנחנו מקווים לראות אתכם בכנס הבא ובימי העיון הבאים של המרכז למורשת יהדות אתיופיה. תודה רבה לכולם ולילה טוב והרבה בריאות לכולם.